Now I just got to live up to, his glowing introduction here. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the Evergreen family. Like, being here is a privilege and an honor. You guys have always thrown your arms open so wide for me personally, with generosity in your relationship to me, but also as a church family, you guys have thrown your arms open wide to our work with Ziva Network. Many of you support individually the work of Ziva Network. As a church family, you have been huge supporters. So I just want to start by saying, first of all, thank you so much for investing in the work that we do and being so generous with your relationship, with your resources. It means the world to me. So thank you for that. Well, today we are going to be looking at the story of the Good Samaritan. Story you've likely heard numerous times. And you know how there are certain stories in scripture that when you first hear them, they like capture you and they resonate, like something deep inside moves you. This story wasn't that for me. Just to be honest, this story wasn't one that I have always embraced as like, oh, that's deep and that's rich. I was kind of like, well, yeah, there's a guy who's hurt. The good guys don't help. The bad guy helps. Be a helper. That's the theme of the story, right? And it didn't resonate deeply for me. But lately I took a second look at this passage, and it turns out I think the reason that it didn't resonate so deeply for me is because I wasn't looking at it very intently. And if I'm really honest, it's probably also because I arrogantly presumed that I had mined the message from it without actually taking a deep look at this story. And when I looked at it again recently, I learned there's a lot more for me to mine from this story. So we're going to be taking a look at that today. I sat down and I looked at it with a fresh eyes and with a soft heart. And as I did that, I noticed something in this story that I missed every other time that I looked at it. And for me, at least, it changed everything. This new perspective changed everything about the way that I understood this story. And not only how I understood this particular story, but also how I understand the heart of God and my role in his big story. So in order to catch this big epiphany of mine, we need to back up a little bit to a few verses to understand what happened just before Jesus launches into this story. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn to Luke 10. That's where the story of the Good Samaritan is found, and we're going to be hanging out there in that passage today, or in that chapter today. So if we are reading from Luke 10, starting at verse 25, it says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You've answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this, and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? So an expert in the law stands up and asks Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus is like, you know this one. How about you tell me? Because I know you know it. And so the guy says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus is like, winner, winner, chicken dinner. You got it. Right answer to the question. Now, how did the guy know that this would, the expert in the law, know it was the right answer to the question? Well, because it's part of Levitical law, right? Deuteronomy 6, Leviticus 19 speaks to these two concepts as part of the law. And this guy, this expert in the law, would have been a diligent scholar of rabbinic tradition. He would have known that these two ideas of loving God and loving neighbor were the essence of the law. Jesus himself quoted these two concepts, both in Matthew and in Mark, as the essence of the law. Paul quotes it in the epistles. Most of us here today who have been discipled in the church for any period of time also would be able to answer this question, right? What's the essence of the law? Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. We know it today as the Great Commandment. And we know this because it's kind of the heart of our whole understanding of what it means to be as a Christian, right? But then this expert asks a follow-up question in this story, and it's not a careless question. He says, "And who is my neighbor?" Now, on the surface, it might seem like that's a good question, right? But Luke tells us something important in the text. Luke says that the man asked this question to justify himself, which means he's not asking, who should I love? Who should I throw my arms open wide for? No, he's looking to justify himself. So he's looking to answer the question, what are my limits? How far do I really have to go? Where can I reasonably draw the line on where my neighbor is? What are those boundary lines all about? What boxes do I need to tick off in order to continue to be a good follower? You see, I don't think this question was at all about learning. This was a man who probably, like me with this story, arrogantly presumed that he knew everything that he needed to know. So his question wasn't about learning. I think his question was about limiting responsibility. And in my mind's eye, I can see Jesus stepping back, sizing him up for a moment, being like, let me tell you a story. And you know, anytime Jesus is like, let me tell you a story, you better buckle up because there are things that are coming. So Jesus begins in Luke chapter 10, verse 30. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, the details here matter. This was a real road that Jesus inserts into his story. This wasn't a fictitious road. This was a real road. And Jerusalem is about 2,500 feet above sea level, and Jericho is about 1,000 feet below sea level. And in a course of about 17 miles, this road dropped 3,500 feet. So it was steep, it was winding, and it was notoriously dangerous. It even had a nickname, the Way of Blood, because it was known to be such a dangerous road. So when Jesus says in the story that this man is attacked by robbers and left for dead, no one listening would have been like, oh, that's unusual, that's strange, how did that happen? They would have been like, yeah, that tracks. That road is dangerous. That's what happens on that road. And so the traveler is left on this road, beaten, naked, half dead, and he is alone, he is vulnerable, he is exposed, and he is unable to help himself. And as we sit with that image, we need to recognize something. We need to recognize that there are people in our world today that are living the exact same reality. They may not be by the side of a literal road, but they are left alone and vulnerable and exposed and unable to help themselves in hidden places all around us. And that matters because remember, Jesus' response to the man's question is this story that is identifying who is my neighbor. Who is my neighbor? The one who is alone, vulnerable, exposed, and unable to help themselves. Jesus continues this story. Verse 31. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. Now, how many of you are old enough like me to remember flannel graph stories in Sunday school? Anyone? Anyone? Okay, some of you are lying. You remember. I remember flannel graph stories, before we had like videos of VeggieTales and things like that. So for those of you that are younger than I and don't know what a flannel graph is, it was this big board that the Sunday school teacher would have. In my case, it was Mrs. Unruh, and there was a big piece of flannel on the board, and then there were these little cutout characters, and she would tell the story using these characters, and so she'd put one character up, and then the next character, and she'd move them along the flannel graph, and that's how we told the stories. I remember the story of the Good Samaritan in flannel graph version. Because in flannel graph version, the priest and the Levite were always very snooty and uptight, and they had scowls on their faces, and they looked very much like pious jerks, right? That was what the priest and Levite looked like in the flannel graph version of this story. And I remember as a kid thinking, there's no way I'm going to be like that guy. I don't walk around like this, scowling. I'm not that guy. But I think we need to be careful. Because in this story, Jesus doesn't tell us why they passed by. And I think that matters. These weren't random people that Jesus put into the story. These were respected, faithful, devoted people. Maybe they weren't pious jerks with a scowl on their face. These would have been good church-going Christians. And this is where it gets a little bit uncomfortable, because I think maybe we're supposed to see ourselves in them. There were very real considerations that the men in this story would have been considering. They would have been navigating the thoughts of, this road is dangerous. Stopping is going to put me at risk. What if the guys that robbed him are waiting to attack me too? What if they were thinking, I don't know what to do. I'm not equipped. It's not safe. I don't know enough about this situation to get involved. It's too big for me. And so they look away and they cross to the other side of the road, but maybe not because they're pious jerks, but maybe because they got locked up and they just didn't know what to do. And who among us here today has not been in that situation at some point or another? You're sitting in your car, you're in a city, you're at a red light, and a homeless guy approaches. And what is your response? You don't know what to do. You get a little afraid. It might not be safe. And so you avoid eye contact. You try to look away and pretend you don't see him. And you hit the gas as soon as the light turns green, right? And you're left with this uncomfortable, nagging feeling inside that maybe I should have or could have done something, but I didn't know what. And you're left with that feeling inside that you hope passes quickly. Because as you pull away, you're thinking, maybe I should have at least looked him in the eye, given him a kind word, something. I think we've all been there at one point or another, where we cross to the other side of the road because we just didn't know what to do. Not because we're bad people, but because we get a little locked up sometimes. And we don't know how to respond. And so the easiest thing is to just say, like, oh, just hit the gas and keep going. Just cross to the other side of the road. Sometimes the gap between seeing a need and responding to a need is filled with very real human hesitation. I'm going to say that again. Sometimes the gap between seeing a need and responding to a need is filled with very real, even valid human hesitation. I think one of the most beautiful things about Jesus' stories is that 2,000 years later, we can still find ourselves in them, right? The story continues, and quite honestly, it gets even more uncomfortable, so here we go. Verse 33, but a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. But a Samaritan. So of course Jesus has to pick the most controversial hero of this story. Now remember, Jesus is speaking to a Jewish audience. So these Jews were already all about who was in and who was out. There were very strong lines drawn around those groups. So in the Jewish way of thinking, they had been waiting for the Messiah for a really, really long time. And as they understood it at the time, the coming of the Messiah was a time for the Jews to be put back in the center of power, for everything to be set right, because they were the chosen ones. Abraham, right? All the way back to Abraham. You were chosen to be God's people. And they had a time when they were it. And then life happened, and then they're waiting for the Messiah again. And what they believe is that when the Messiah comes, they are going to be restored to the center of power. They were the chosen ones, and it was really easy to define who was in and who was out. But Jesus comes and starts hinting at the fact that he is the Messiah, and then even more scandalously starts suggesting that maybe he came for all people, not just the Jewish people. And these Jewish experts are a little on edge because Jesus is pushing against every category and boundary that they had relied on for a really long time. But a Samaritan is what Jesus says. A Samaritan. Samaritans, according to this expert in the law, a Samaritan would have been an impure half-breed, which is what made him so detestable to Jewish purists. Samaritans were corrupting the Jewish bloodline. They carried some Jewish blood, but they were not the chosen ones. And so if you're drawing lines around who is in and who is out, a Samaritan 100% is out. And yet Jesus makes the Samaritan the hero. But what does Jesus use to define the Samaritan in the story? Outside of just calling him a Samaritan, the only other defining characteristic he gives him is what? That he felt pity. He was moved to compassion, some versions say. The Samaritan was the only one in the story that Jesus says felt something. And that something that he was feeling, that love, we might also call it, is what compelled him to action. He was the only one who engaged his heart despite the categories, despite the boundary lines. He's the only one who loved his neighbor and let that love lead his actions. I don't think Jesus was just trying to surprise and shock people in the story. I think what he's trying to do is dismantle their categories. The expert in the law, he wanted categories. He wanted to define limits. He wanted to know who's in and who's out, who deserves my help, who doesn't deserve my help. Who am I supposed to love? Who is okay for me to say, you are not acceptable. You don't deserve my help and assistance. Give me clear parameters about who's worthy and who is not, because if you give me rules, I'm great at being righteous by the letter of the law. And Jesus is saying, your neighbor is not someone like you. Your neighbor is not someone you agree with or necessarily feel comfortable with. The challenge Jesus gives us here is about dropping all assumptions about who is deserving or undeserving, who's an insider, who's an outsider, who is worthy, who is unworthy. Your neighbor, according to this story that Jesus is telling us, your neighbor is the one who has a need, who is vulnerable, exposed, alone, and unable to help himself. He didn't choose the Samaritan as the hero just to surprise people. He chose him, I think, to expose how quickly we trust our categories more than our compassion. That kind of gut checks me a little bit, because I can sometimes default to my categories. That God is calling me to compassion, regardless of how I feel about someone's political situation or affiliation or religious affiliation, regardless of whether I approve of their lifestyle or not, regardless of whatever opinions I have about whether they're deserving or not, you made your own bed or not. In this story, Jesus is dismantling those categories, and he's saying you don't get a pass on that. Your neighbor is the one who has a need. He's not my backyard barbecue pal. By definition, my neighbor is the one who is exposed, alone, and unable to help himself. And compassion is what makes the Samaritan different. not his ethnicity, not his nationality or his social status, that defines him in Jesus' category or in Jesus' story. It is his compassion. And here's why that matters. In this story, the Samaritan faced the same layers that the priest and the Levite did. Maybe it's not safe. He probably didn't know exactly what to do or how to respond either. It probably felt big to him, too. He didn't know the situation surrounding what had happened. But here's the thing, the Samaritan in this story, he didn't remove the layers. He had the same layers. He didn't remove them, but he moved through them. He moved through them. Why? Because he was filled with compassion. Because he chose to love over his own comfort. You see, I don't think Jesus told this story because he wanted to point out bad people and good people. I don't think this story is about bad people ignoring or trying to find a way around doing good. I think this story is about good people, all of them navigating complexity and choosing differently. I don't know that Jesus is trying to say the priest and the Levite are pious jerks. I think he's trying to say they're all good people, and we all have to navigate hard things. What are you going to choose? And compassion is the refusal to disengage our hearts, even when there may be 100 reasons why it makes sense to walk away. Compassion is choosing to roll up our sleeves and to dig in, even if it costs us something. And I want us to note the Samaritan's response. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Look closely at what he does. He knelt beside the wounded man. He soothes his wounds. He lifts the man onto his own donkey. He takes him to an inn. He pays 2 pieces of silver, which would have been about 2 days' wages, as I understand it. And then he says to the innkeeper, take care of him. I'll check back. And I think in this story, this is another gift that Jesus gives us in this story. I think the role of the innkeeper is way too often overlooked. We often miss this, that the Samaritan does not do everything himself. He connects the wounded man with someone who can help and make sure he gets the care that he needs. But he wasn't doing it all. And this is a huge gift that I think Jesus gives us in this story, that we are not asked to do it all. Sometimes I get paralyzed when I see an issue because I don't even know where to start. And it feels too big and it feels too overwhelming. And often, at least for me, the tendency is to do nothing because I can't do everything. I'm not going to be able to take it all the way to the end. I don't know how to take it all the way to the finish line. So I'm just going to back away because I can't do it all. And Jesus in this story is showing us you don't have to do it all. Just get someone connected to the help that they need. You don't have to do it all. You just can't not see them. The Samaritan simply did what he could with what he had and connected the man to others. And then in the story, Jesus turns the question back to the expert who asked the question in the first place. Who was the neighbor to the wounded man? Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. The expert realizes it was the one who showed mercy, the one whose heart was moved to compassion. He was the neighbor, the Samaritan. He was the one who responded out of a motivation of love. And Jesus says, go and do the same. Open your eyes to your neighbors. Go love them. And remember at the beginning when I told you I kind of had a whole new perspective on how I see this story and my role in God's bigger story? This is where it all comes together for me. Because the Great Commandment that spans both the Old Testament and the New Testament writings, to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, is answered in this story. Because when Jesus is asked to define who our neighbor is, he answers with a story that tells us our neighbor is the one in the ditch. When we are asked to love God and love our neighbor, we are asked to love God and love the one who has a need, the one who is alone, the one who is vulnerable, the one who is exposed, the one who is unable to help himself. The Great Commandment isn't calling me to just love people as a general category. It's asking me to love the vulnerable. I've heard many sum up the Great Commandment as love God and love people. And I think there's truth to it to an extent, but I think it's an oversimplification. You've seen the banner on church walls, right? Love God, love people. And it's true, but I think it's a little too simplified, because after studying this passage, I feel like we can excuse ourselves by that definition. Because there are plenty of people that I love, people who think like me, act like me, people who are easy to love. I love those people. So I can feel good that I'm living out the Great Commandment, right? Because I love God and I love most people. Go me. But when we read love God and love your neighbor in this parable, and Jesus is defining our neighbor as the one who is wounded and in need of healing, as one who needs our presence and our compassion, as one who needs us to give something of ourselves to them, that changes my whole perspective on what I'm being asked of in the Great Commandment. And I'm learning slowly, I'm a slow learner. I am slowly learning what it means to walk into that and what God is asking of me in that. And it took a while for me to finally walk into our work with human trafficking survivors. For the longest time, I felt every single one of those layers. It is too big. I don't know what to do. I'm not equipped. What if I do more damage than good? I don't know what I'm doing. That's going to be hard. Every time I let my heart start opening to this, it just crushes and crumbles, and that feels really scary, and that feels really uncomfortable. So maybe we just lock that down again, because I don't want to feel all those things, especially when I don't know what to do about it. So it was easy for me to walk to the other side of the road. But God kept nudging my heart to have compassion for this group that, like none other, in my opinion, are hurting and alone and vulnerable and exposed. Pastor Keith talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but did you know that human trafficking has been reported in every single zip code in the state of Michigan? Every single one. Did you know that most victims have faced trauma all of their lives? 84% of human trafficking victims have a history of childhood abuse and trauma. They've lived in trauma and pain all of their lives. Familial trafficking makes up a whopping, this statistic is hard for me, a whopping 42% of trafficking victims, meaning that these people are being trafficked at the hands of their own family members, often behind closed doors, where on the outside everything looks like it's going just fine. But the atrocities that are happening behind closed doors in 42% of cases in the US. We recently hosted a big event at our tea shop. Some of you came, thank you for coming. Some of you supported, thank you for that. But we had a guest speaker who came to share her story because she had asked to come and share her story, which was a beautiful thing. She's at a place in her healing where she said, I want to give back. I want something good to come from all of the horrors that I have suffered. And she's figuring it out. So she came and she shared her story. She was a victim of familial trafficking. Her earliest memories from 3 on, it was a pedophile situation. And from 3 years old on, her memories are being sold for sex at the hands of her own mother. And once God started breaking my heart with these realities, I couldn't unsee them. I couldn't walk to the other side of the road anymore. And at the same time, I didn't know what to do. So big. Until I got to a point where God said, you can't not do something anymore. And that's how Ziva Network began. We started somewhere. We started small with what we had, and we're baby stepping into what we believe God is calling us forward to. One of our primary programs are respite retreats for survivors and for the organizations who serve them. And we had the privilege this past week of hosting another group from the Detroit area of survivors, a group of women that we just spent time with over the course of several days. And their strength, their resiliency, their honesty was just so incredibly beautiful to me. And we just slowed down and offered them space to reflect and to rest, because they've not had that much in their life at all. And we ended our time together with a foot washing ceremony, which is a little bit of a risk to be like, let's try this, see how this goes. But I have to tell you, it was probably the most holy moment I have experienced in a really long time. Because as we sat down in that circle, getting ready to wash one another's feet, there was one woman in the group, and she said, before we start, I need to tell you all something, and I've never said this to anyone before. She said, when I was being trafficked, well, this is what she first said, this is a full circle moment for me. She said, because when I was being trafficked, I was part of a ring, and I started to think that maybe I wanted to try to see if I could get away. And she whispered something to someone else about maybe trying to want to get away. And she said somehow it got back to the top girl, which in trafficking terminology, the top girl is the woman who works most closely with the pimp, keeps all the other women in line. She is typically very, very brutal. Somehow this woman's whispers about maybe wanting to make a change, wanting to try to get away, got back to the top girl. And so the top girl came, and she poured boiling water all over the feet of this woman, leaving them blistered, scarred, scalded. And then here we were, getting ready to wash each other's feet. And she was saying how meaningful it was to her to have her feet treated with such care and honor and respect. And she gave all credit to Jesus for bringing that around. And it was so beautiful to see her have her feet washed with that kind of care. But then the thing that 100% broke me was that she got down on her knees and she washed the feet of the woman next to her. And she did it with the most beautiful, honest, sincere care I have ever seen pour out of anyone in my life. And I was ugly crying because it was a sacred, holy moment that I will never forget. And I feel so privileged that we get to be a part of that. So yeah, it was scary walking into this world of human trafficking, but what God pours back as we're obedient in that, there's just no measure for it. That's one of the things we get to do with Ziva Network. Another privilege that I get as part of my work with Ziva Network is a forest therapy program. I have to be careful how I say that, because if I say it too quickly, it sounds like forced therapy, like we're forcing kids into therapy. No, it's forest in the woods therapy program that I get to spend an hour a week with at-risk students. And we just go out into the woods and we give them space to settle their minds and their bodies. And we have conversations that hopefully let them know that there are people in their world who care, who want to walk alongside, who want to help. Remember when I said that A huge percentage of trafficking victims come from childhood abuse, neglect, and trauma. That's this population. And so we want to walk alongside them. And we want to let them know that they're seen. That maybe you are feeling like you're sitting by the side of the road right now, but I'm going to cross over and I'm going to kneel there with you at least for a little while. It's a privilege that I get to do that as part of this work. We're also envisioning at Ziva Network this restorative care idea, long-term restorative care, walking with women who get out of initial stages of recovery, but still need someone to walk alongside them so that that healing process can continue. Sadly, there is a huge percentage of recidivism of women who get out of the life initial trauma care and recovery only to find themselves back into the same cycles and patterns because they haven't had the long-term support that they need. And so that's another dream of ours. When God is asking me to love my neighbors, these women, they are my neighbors. And I am so glad that he's pushing me to see them, to truly see them. And I wonder today what your nudge is. Who is God asking you to see? What categories is he trying to say, break them down? Who you think is worthy of it or not worthy of it? Is there someone that God is nudging you and saying, I need you to see these people or this person? And I want to end today with a challenge, not a guilt trip. Somewhere along the road where the priest passes by and the Samaritan stops, there is a moment and there's a choice. And Jesus isn't asking you to solve everything, but he's asking you to stop and look. I promise you, he is asking you to stop and look. So who is it that God is asking you to see? Which neighbor? Which hurting person who is alone and vulnerable are you being asked to stop for? If you felt something stir when I talked about Ziva, I'd love to have the conversation with you. Don't brush past that. And I don't know what that would look like, quite honestly, but let's schedule a time to have a conversation. If it's something else, maybe it's another group that keeps coming back and you keep doing the like, nope, I don't want to, but God keeps putting that group or that person. Maybe that's the nudge that you need to follow. Don't keep walking by. Do what you can with what you have and trust God to take care of the rest. Let's pray together. Jesus, thank you for the way that you define neighbor. I pray that you redefine it in our hearts as well. Let it settle deep what you are asking of us when it means to love you and to love our neighbor. Open our eyes and make us willing to see those who are broken by the side of the road. Give us the courage that we need to stop and to not look away because we're uncomfortable or afraid or not knowing what to do. Help us to simply keep walking next to, stopping with the people that you're asking us to see, and help us to do what we can with what we have and trust you with the rest. Thank you for loving me so thoroughly. Thank you for loving each person that you have made with an endless, extravagant love. Teach me to love like you, Jesus. Amen.